The conference room door slammed open with the force of someone who'd never been denied. She strode in like she owned the building, which, technically, her family did. Victoria Hudson, the CFO's daughter, crossed the room in sharp clicks of designer heels, dropping a manila envelope onto the conference table and said, "This is effective immediately. HR will manage the transition." No explanation, no eye contact, just the cold precision of someone removing an inconvenience. I looked down at the termination letter bearing my name, Ava Mitchell, Senior Patent Engineer. The date stamped at the top was impossible to ignore. Exactly 72 hours before my $150,000 stock vesting was scheduled to finalize. 7 years of deferred compensation, erased with a single stroke of a pen. Victoria might have thought the timing was cunning, cutting me loose before the payout, saving the company money, but she had no idea what she had unleashed. I'd spent those 7 years at Nexus Technologies not just as an engineer, but as the architect of our entire intellectual property portfolio. Every patent application, every technical specification, every piece of proprietary technology that made our company valuable, my name was on the inventor documentation. That $150,000 vesting wasn't just deferred salary. It was the final trigger in a patent assignment agreement I had negotiated when I was young and naive enough to believe loyalty mattered. A clause that returned full ownership of my inventions to me if vesting was interrupted by involuntary termination. The company's lawyers had signed off on it years ago, assuming it would never come into play. They assumed I'd always be there, climbing the corporate ladder while my stock options matured on schedule. Now, Victoria had just initiated a countdown that would strip Nexus of the one asset holding their $500 million acquisition together. The acquiring company, Tech Global Industries, wasn't buying our office space or client list. They were buying our patent portfolio, specifically my autonomous systems patents that powered everything from manufacturing robots to medical devices. Patents that, in 72 hours, would no longer belong to Nexus Technologies. She paused at the doorway, checking her phone as if this were just another task crossed off her list. I didn't speak. I didn't need to. In 3 days, the truth would resonate louder than any protest I could raise. Victoria Hudson had just lit the fuse on her own family's financial empire, and she had no clue. 7 years is long enough to watch a startup evolve from a cramped warehouse into a gleaming corporate headquarters. Long enough to see ping-pong tables replaced by mahogany conference rooms and employee badges jump from double digits to 4 figures. Long enough to carry a company from obscurity to acquisition target. And I had done exactly that. I joined Nexus Technologies straight out of graduate school when we were still 15 people crammed into a converted warehouse in the industrial district. The coffee was awful, the heating barely worked, and the founding team labored 18-hour days fueled by equal parts caffeine and stubborn belief that we could revolutionize autonomous systems. Back then, Victoria's father, CFO Marcus Hudson, was just Mark, the numbers guy who made sure we could afford ramen and server hosting fees. Victoria herself was finishing college, making occasional appearances at company barbecues with the casual entitlement of someone who never worried about next month's rent. I wasn't just writing code or filing patent applications. I was designing the foundational architecture that would become our competitive advantage. Late nights in the lab, I developed sensor fusion algorithms that allowed machines to navigate complex environments without human intervention. Weekend prototype sessions produced machine learning models that could predict equipment failures before they occurred. Every breakthrough, every innovation, every technical milestone bore my fingerprints. The patents began flowing by year 2: autonomous navigation systems, predictive maintenance algorithms, human-machine interface protocols. Each application listed me as primary inventor with Nexus Technologies as assignee, standard practice in the tech world. The company owns what you create on company time. But I wasn't standard practice. During my initial contract negotiations, fresh out of graduate school and armed with more technical knowledge than business sense, I had insisted on a clause that seemed reasonable at the time. If my employment was terminated involuntarily before my stock fully vested, the patent assignments would revert to me personally. The company's lawyers barely glanced at it. They were more preoccupied with non-compete clauses and salary. Structures. A patent reversion clause triggered by involuntary termination before vesting. It seemed like a technicality that would never matter. By year 4, those patents were generating serious licensing revenue. Manufacturing companies paid 7 figures annually just to utilize our navigation algorithms. Medical device companies built entire product lines around our safety protocols. The Department of Defense was a client, along with 3 of the world's largest automotive manufacturers. I wasn't just an employee anymore. I was the technical backbone supporting an increasingly valuable company. Every board presentation included slides highlighting our patent portfolio. Every investor pitch emphasized our defensible IP model. Every acquisition discussion began with a thorough review of our intellectual property assets. And at the center of it all was my work, protected by patents, generating revenue, and making Nexus Technologies a $500 million acquisition target. Marcus Hudson's quarterly financial reports always contained a section on IP value creation. The numbers were staggering. $40 million in annual licensing revenue, $200 million in estimated portfolio value, and projections showing continued growth as autonomous systems expanded into new markets. What those reports didn't reveal was that the majority of that value was tied to patents where I was listed as the primary inventor. I watched Victoria grow up during those 7 years, evolving from a college student into a confident young executive with an MBA and her father's sharp analytical mind. She joined the company officially 2 years ago as Director of Strategic Initiatives, a role seemingly custom designed to give her board experience without actually requiring her to produce measurable results. In meetings, she spoke with the casual authority of someone who inherited access rather than earned it. She used phrases like optimizing synergies and leveraging core competencies, while the rest of us handled the technical realities of actually building products that worked. I observed her present quarterly updates on initiatives that were really just repackaged versions of work my team had completed months earlier. But Victoria was intelligent, and she was learning quickly. She understood that perception often outweighed technical reality in corporate environments. She cultivated relationships with board members, spoke their language of quarterly metrics and strategic positioning, and gradually positioned herself as someone who grasped both the technology and the business side. The irony was that she was correct about understanding the business. She just didn't comprehend the technical foundations that business was built upon. She knew our patents were valuable, but she never bothered to read the actual patent applications or see who was listed as the inventor. She knew licensing revenue mattered, but she never traced where those licenses originated. So, when she walked into that conference room and handed me my termination letter, she was making a calculated business decision based on incomplete information. Cut the high-salary engineer before her stock vests, save $150,000, and proceed with the acquisition using the company assets she assumed would remain company assets. She had no idea she had just triggered a clause that would transfer those assets directly to me, making her family's $500 million windfall impossible to realize. The pride I had felt in building something meaningful was still there, but it was now fused with a cold satisfaction I couldn't ignore. 7 years of watching my work get repackaged and presented by others. 7 years of seeing the Hudson family benefit from innovations they'd never contributed to. 7 years of being treated like a replaceable component in a machine I had designed myself. Victoria thought she was making a smart financial move. What she had actually done was hand me the keys to the kingdom and given me every reason to use them. If the second part of my story was about the years I spent building Nexus technologies, then this part is about the person who thought she could dismantle my contribution in a single conversation. Victoria Hudson didn't earn her position through technical skill or years of grinding through complex problems. She inherited it, not through any particular qualification beyond sharing DNA with the CFO and holding an MBA from an expensive school her father's connections had helped her access. Before joining Nexus officially, Victoria had worked at two prestigious consulting firms, the kind that charged Fortune 500 companies millions of dollars to tell them things their own employees already knew. Her resume looked impressive on paper. McKinsey and Bain Capital strategic advisory roles that sounded important and paid extremely well. What the resume didn't capture was that she had never actually built anything, never stayed long enough at any position to see the long-term consequences of her recommendations, and never worked in an environment where technical reality could override clever presentations. When she arrived at Nexus 2 years ago, she carried the confidence of someone accustomed to being the smartest person in the room. Her first all-hands presentation was memorable, not for any strategic insight she offered, but for the way she managed to use leveraging our core IP assets and synergistic value creation in the same sentence without actually saying anything substantive. I remember sitting in the back of that meeting, watching her click through slides filled with consultant jargon and matrix charts, thinking how different her language was from the technical documentation I wrote every day, where I specified exact parameters, testing protocols, and measurable outcomes. She dealt in abstractions and possibilities. Where I focused on solving specific problems, she focused on optimizing strategic positioning. It became a pattern in board meetings and client presentations. Victoria would set the stage with high-level strategic framing, talking about market opportunities and competitive advantages, while I would be called in to handle the technical details that actually mattered. She was excellent at making our company sound innovative and forward-thinking. I was the one who made sure our innovations actually worked. The division of labor might have been sustainable if she had stayed in her lane, but Victoria was ambitious, and she had inherited more than just her father's analytical mind. She had also inherited his eye for opportunities and his understanding that perception often mattered more than reality in corporate environments. 6 months ago, she began inserting herself into technical discussions she didn't fully comprehend. During a client presentation for our largest automotive contract, she interrupted my explanation of sensor redundancy protocols to add her own interpretation that was both unnecessary and technically inaccurate. I had to correct her subtly without making it obvious she had been wrong, all while maintaining the professional demeanor that kept our client relationship intact. The moment that crystallized my view of Victoria happened 3 months before my termination. Tech Global Industries had just started acquisition discussions, and the due diligence process was in full swing. Their technical team wanted detailed documentation on our patent portfolio, not just the legal filings, but the actual research and development process that led to each innovation. I spent 2 weeks preparing comprehensive technical briefings complete with prototype demonstrations, performance data, and development timelines. The presentation was scheduled for a Tuesday morning, and I planned to walk Tech Global's engineers through each patent in detail, answering their questions and demonstrating real-world applications. The night before the presentation, Victoria called an emergency meeting. She decided the technical presentation was too detailed and might overwhelm the business stakeholders in the room. Instead, she wanted to lead with strategic context and market positioning, relegating the technical demonstration to a brief appendix at the end. I pushed back, explaining that Tech Global's engineers weren't interested in market positioning. They wanted to understand what they were buying and whether our technology actually worked as promised. Victoria smiled that patient smile of someone explaining something obvious to someone slow and said, "Ava, I think you're underestimating how these high-level conversations work. They want to understand the strategic value first, then dive into technical details. The next morning, she led the presentation with 30 minutes of market analysis and competitive positioning. By the time we reached the technical demonstration, Tech Global's engineers were checking their phones and glancing at their watches. The session that should have been a detailed technical deep dive became a rushed overview that left more questions than answers. After the meeting, Tech Global's lead engineer pulled me aside privately. "We're going to need those detailed technical sessions," he said. "The strategic overview was nice, but we need to understand what we're actually acquiring." I scheduled separate technical sessions for the following week, working around Victoria's calendar to make sure she wouldn't optimize those meetings as well. That incident wasn't unique. Victoria had a talent for positioning herself as the strategic mastermind while treating technical expertise as a supporting detail. In her mind, the patents were valuable because they generated licensing revenue and made the company attractive to acquirers. She never seemed to understand that patents were valuable because they protected specific innovations that solved real problems for real clients. The contempt I developed for her wasn't personal. It was the kind of cold professional judgment you make when you realize someone in authority fundamentally misunderstands the system they are trying to control. Victoria knew how to read financial statements and build PowerPoint presentations, but she had never spent a weekend debugging code or redesigning a prototype that didn't work. She had never taken a client call at 2 a.m. because a system failure was costing them millions per hour. When she walked into that conference room and handed me the termination letter, her expression was the same patient smile she had worn during that pre-presentation meeting. The smile of someone who believed she understood the situation better than the technical expert she was dismissing. She had no idea that my understanding of the situation included patent assignment clauses, vesting schedules, and legal documentation she never bothered to read. She thought she was making a smart business decision based on her strategic insight. What she had actually done was prove that all her MBA training and consulting experience had failed to teach her the most critical lesson in business. Understand what you're actually selling before deciding who is essential to the sale. The morning after Victoria handed me that termination letter, I was wide awake before sunrise, my mind cycling through every detail of the Tech Global Industries acquisition. 9 months of negotiations, technical demonstrations, and due diligence reviews. All of it centered around the patent portfolio I had spent 7 years creating and protecting. From the very first conversation with Tech Global's technical team, it was clear they weren't buying Nexus for our brand recognition or client relationships. They were buying our intellectual property, specifically the autonomous systems patents that formed the foundation of their expansion into robotics and AI-driven manufacturing. That meant they were buying me, whether Victoria realized it or not. The acquisition discussions had started almost a year earlier when Tech Global CEO David reached out to Marcus Hudson after reading about our latest patent applications in an industry publication. Tech Global was a massive industrial conglomerate with operations in 40 countries, but they were behind the curve on autonomous systems. Rather than spend 5 years developing their own technology, they wanted to acquire a company that had already solved the hard problems. The initial meetings were exploratory, the careful conversations that occur when both sides know they might want to do business, but nobody wants to reveal their hand too early. Marcus brought me into those early discussions because Tech Global's questions were highly technical. They wanted to understand not just what our patents covered, but how the underlying technology actually worked and whether it could scale to their global operations. I remember the first video conference with David and his technical director, Sarah Kim. They asked pointed questions about sensor fusion algorithms, real-time processing requirements, and fail-safe mechanisms. These weren't business development questions. They were engineering questions from people who understood the technical challenges of deploying autonomous systems at industrial scale. Kim was particularly focused on our predictive maintenance patents. Tech Global operated thousands of manufacturing facilities, and unplanned equipment downtime cost them hundreds of millions annually. Our algorithms could predict mechanical failures weeks before they occurred, allowing for scheduled maintenance that minimized production disruption. "This isn't just efficiency improvement," she told me during one call. "This is a fundamental change in how we approach industrial operations." As the discussions progressed, it became clear that Tech Global's interest was specifically tied to the technical capabilities I had developed. They wanted exclusive licensing rights to our entire patent portfolio, plus access to the research and development infrastructure that had produced those patents. More importantly, they wanted assurance that the key personnel behind the technology would remain involved during the integration process. That assurance became formalized in the acquisition agreement as a key personnel retention clause. The document listed 3 people as essential to the transition: Marcus Hudson for financial oversight, our VP of operations for client relationship management, and me for technical leadership and IP integration. If any of the 3 named individuals left Nexus before the acquisition closed, Tech Global had the right to renegotiate terms or withdraw from the deal entirely. I flagged that clause during the contract review, not because I was planning to leave, but because I understood how easily corporate decisions could create problems later. Victoria had been present for that discussion, nodding along as the lawyers explained the implications, but I wondered if she had actually processed what it meant. In her world, employees were replaceable resources. In Tech Global's world, I was irreplaceable infrastructure. The due diligence process had been exhaustive. Tech Global's technical team spent weeks reviewing every patent application, every piece of supporting documentation, every research note I had generated over 7 years. They conducted independent assessments of our technology, brought in external consultants to verify our claims, and ran their own tests on our prototype systems. 3 weeks before my termination, I received an email from Kim with the subject line, "Final technical validation complete." Her message was brief, but definitive. "All systems exceed specifications. Ready to recommend deal approval to board." That email was the green light Tech Global's executives had been waiting for. The technology worked as promised. The patents were solid, and the integration plan was feasible. But there was a detail buried in the patent documentation that Tech Global's lawyers had noted during their review: the unusual assignment clause in my employment contract. Most employment agreements included standard language transferring all inventions to the company. My contract included that language, but with an additional provision that reversed the assignment if my employment was terminated involuntarily before my stock fully vested. Tech Global's legal team had flagged it as a potential risk and requested clarification from Nexus. Marcus's lawyers had responded with a brief memo explaining that the clause was a technicality from my original hiring negotiations, unlikely to ever be triggered because the company had no intention of terminating key personnel before vesting schedules completed. The exchange was buried in hundreds of pages of legal documentation, and I doubt Victoria had ever seen it. She was focused on the high-level deal structure, the purchase price, and the timeline for closing. She wasn't reading through employment contract details or thinking about how patent assignments actually worked. That morning, staring at the ceiling before dawn, I realized that Victoria's decision to terminate me wasn't just a personnel move. It was a trigger that would activate the exact scenario Tech Global's lawyers had identified as a deal breaker. In 72 hours, my patents would revert to my personal ownership, making it impossible for Nexus to transfer them to Tech Global as part of the acquisition. The $500 million deal wasn't just at stake, it was already dead, and Victoria had killed it without even realizing she had pulled the trigger. I thought about David and Kim, probably sitting in Tech Global's headquarters planning the integration process, unaware that the technical foundation they wanted to acquire was about to vanish. I thought about Marcus Hudson, who had built his financial projections around a $500 million windfall that would never materialize. And I thought about Victoria, who had made a decision based on saving $150,000 in vesting payments, not realizing she had just cost her family's company $500 million in acquisition proceeds. Sometimes the most expensive mistakes are the ones that look like smart business decisions on the surface. The one thing Victoria probably expected when she handed me that termination letter was a fight. She had prepared for pushback, for arguments about unfair treatment, for desperate negotiations over severance packages or extended notice periods. Corporate executives learn to brace themselves for the emotions that come with letting people go, especially those who had been with the company for years. Instead, I picked up the pen she had placed next to the manila envelope and signed my name in clean, confident strokes. The letter was printed on Nexus Technologies' letterhead, the familiar logo that had been redesigned 3 times during my 7 years with the company. My termination was outlined in precise legal language. Effective immediately, company restructuring, position elimination, standard corporate phrases designed to make the decision feel inevitable rather than personal. I read through it once, not because I needed to understand the terms, but because I wanted Victoria to see me taking it seriously. The key details were exactly what I had expected. Immediate termination, 2 weeks severance pay, standard non-disclosure agreements, and a reminder that all company property should be returned promptly. What the letter didn't mention, what Victoria clearly didn't know to include, was anything about patent assignments, intellectual property rights, or the vesting schedule that was about to become the most expensive oversight in Nexus Technologies' corporate history. I signed at the bottom, dated it, and slid the paper across the conference table. My signature looked exactly the same as it did on patent applications, employment contracts, and the hundreds of technical documents I had authored over the years. Steady, professional, untroubled. "That's it?" Victoria asked, and I caught the slight note of surprise in her voice. "That's it," I confirmed, capping the pen and placing it next to the signed document. She had expected drama, but drama would have been counterproductive. Fighting the decision would have given her insight into my reaction, my plans, my understanding of what she had just triggered. Signing quietly gave her the opposite, confidence that she had handled a difficult personnel decision cleanly and professionally. HR was waiting outside the conference room, 2 representatives I had worked with for years during the hiring process for my team. They offered the same polite efficiency they showed all terminated employees: directions for returning company equipment, information about Cobra health insurance continuation, and escort procedures for collecting personal items from my office. I nodded and followed them down the hallway I had walked thousands of times, past the wall of framed patents that included my name on 2/3 of the displayed documents. Victoria stayed behind in the conference room, probably already moving on to her next agenda item, satisfied that an uncomfortable conversation was finished. My office was on the 3rd floor, corner space with windows overlooking the downtown district where Nexus had grown from startup to acquisition target. 7 years of work were accumulated in that space: technical textbooks, prototype components, printed patents, and 3 monitors that had displayed thousands of hours of code and documentation. The HR representatives waited politely while I gathered personal items into a cardboard box: family photos, a few engineering awards, the coffee mug my graduate school advisor had given me. I left everything else. The technical books could be replaced, the prototype components belonged to the company, and the monitors would be assigned to whoever inherited my role. There was one item I made sure to leave behind: a USB drive sitting prominently on my desk next to my keyboard. Victoria had been watching from the doorway as I packed, and her eyes lingered on that drive for several seconds. I could almost see her mental calculation: backup files, proprietary information, technical documentation she might try to seize. The truth was that the USB drive contained nothing but empty folders and a few outdated presentations from 2 years ago. Every actual backup, every piece of current technical work, Every document that mattered was stored in encrypted cloud repositories, accessible only through biometric authentication linked to my personal accounts. Victoria had no way to access any of it, but the prominently placed USB drive would give her the false confidence that all critical information was still inside the building. The walk to the elevator was quiet. The HR representatives maintained their professional demeanor, treating the situation as routine rather than dramatic. I appreciated that there was no need for artificial sympathy or awkward small talk about how sorry they were to see me go. As the elevator descended toward the lobby, I thought about the countdown already running in the back of my mind. 71 hours, 15 minutes, and approximately 30 seconds until my stock vesting was scheduled to complete, and the patent assignment clause would trigger. Victoria thought she had saved the company $150,000 by terminating me before vesting. What she had actually done was activate a legal mechanism that would transfer millions of dollars in intellectual property assets directly to me, making her family's $500 million acquisition impossible to complete. The elevator doors opened into the lobby where I had entered as an eager new hire 7 years ago, where I had brought clients for meetings, where I had celebrated patent approvals and successful product launches. Now I was leaving with a cardboard box and knowledge that could dismantle the company's future. I walked across the marble floor toward the glass exit doors, noting my reflection in the polished surface, composed, unhurried, carrying myself like someone completing a routine business transaction rather than someone who had just been fired. Behind me, somewhere in the building, Victoria was probably updating her status report to mark personnel restructuring complete as a checked item. She had no idea she had just triggered a 72-hour countdown that would detonate beneath the foundation of everything her family had built. Sometimes the most devastating weapons are the ones disguised as routine paperwork. My apartment was 15 minutes from Nexus headquarters, close enough for the occasional late-night emergency call, far enough to maintain some psychological separation between work and personal life. That boundary was about to become irrelevant. I set the cardboard box on my kitchen counter and went directly to the spare bedroom I had converted into a home office years ago. This wasn't a space for casual laptop work or paying bills online. It was a technical workspace, enterprise-grade monitors, redundant network connections, and security protocols that would have impressed the cybersecurity team at Nexus. The walls were lined with whiteboards covered in system diagrams, patent sketches, and technical notes representing years of research and development. Everything important I had ever worked on had been documented here first, then refined and tested before making its way into official company systems. I powered up the workstation and logged into my secure environment. The main dashboard displayed exactly what I expected to see: a countdown timer reading 71 hours, 23 minutes, and 47 seconds. No flashing alerts, no dramatic sound effects. Just time moving steadily toward a legal deadline that would transfer ownership of my patents from Nexus Technologies directly to me. The patent assignment clause wasn't just contract language. It was code embedded in a legal framework that would execute automatically when specific conditions were met. Involuntary termination before stock vesting. Check. Primary inventor status on the affected patents. Check. Original employment contract language still in effect. Check. I opened a secure folder labeled IP documentation and began reviewing the patent portfolio about to become my personal property. 14 major patents covering autonomous systems, predictive maintenance algorithms, and human-machine interface protocols. Current estimated value, according to the most recent corporate insurance assessment, $340 million. Annual licensing revenue generated by those patents, $47 million. In 71 hours, Victoria's $150,000 cost-saving measure would transfer $340 million in assets and $47 million in annual revenue away from Nexus Technologies. The mathematics of her mistake were staggering. Next, I verified the technical safeguards I had built into the system over the years. Patent documentation was stored in encrypted repositories with multi-factor authentication. Source code was backed up across multiple secure cloud platforms. Research data was protected by biometric access controls that only I could authorize. Even if Nexus wanted to contest the patent transfer, they would need my cooperation to access the underlying technical documentation supporting each patent application. They wouldn't get that cooperation. I opened my secure email client and found the draft message I had prepared months earlier as a contingency plan. The subject line read, Patent Ownership Transfer Notification. Recipients, David at Tech Global Industries, Sarah Kim, and Tech Global's head of legal affairs. The message was straightforward and factual. Effective timestamp. The autonomous systems patents central to the Nexus Tech Global acquisition have been transferred to Ava Mitchell LLC per original employment contract provisions. Please review the attached ownership documentation and contact me directly regarding future licensing arrangements. The email was scheduled to send automatically when the countdown timer reached 0. No manual intervention required on my part. No dramatic moment of decision, just an automated notification that would inform Tech Global the intellectual property they believed they were acquiring was no longer available. Attached to the email were PDF copies of all relevant patent documents, updated ownership certificates, and a brief technical summary of each patent's commercial applications. Everything Tech Global would need to understand that their $500 million deal had just evaporated. I leaned back in my chair and allowed myself a moment of quiet satisfaction. The system was elegant in its simplicity. Victoria's decision had triggered a cascade of legal and technical consequences that she couldn't reverse, even if she understood them, which she didn't. The irony was perfect. She terminated me to save money on stock vesting, not realizing that the vesting schedule was tied directly to patent ownership rights, forming the foundation of her family's financial future. Her cost-cutting measure was about to become the most expensive decision in Nexus Technologies' corporate history. I glanced back at the countdown. 71 hours, 18 minutes, and 22 seconds. The apartment was quiet except for the low hum of computer fans and the distant sound of traffic outside. I made myself a cup of coffee and settled in to wait. Patience had always been one of my strengths as an engineer. The ability to design systems that would work correctly over time, then trust those systems to execute as planned. This was just another system, and it was executing perfectly. In less than 3 days, Tech Global would receive an email that would destroy their acquisition plans. Nexus would lose the patents that made them valuable, and Victoria would learn that firing the person who built the company's technical foundation was not, in fact, a smart business decision. All I had to do was wait for the countdown to reach 0. Some victories require decisive action. Others require the patience to let your opponents defeat themselves. The next morning, I woke before dawn and decided to take a walk through the downtown district where I had spent the last 7 years of my professional life. The streets were empty except for the occasional delivery truck and early shift workers heading to coffee shops that wouldn't open for another hour. I wanted to see the world as it existed before everything changed. In less than 60 hours, the financial landscape of the tech sector in our city would shift dramatically. Nexus Technologies would lose their acquisition deal. Tech Global would need to find alternative expansion strategies, and I would own patents worth more than most startup companies. The walk took me past the coffee shop where I had spent countless mornings reviewing technical documentation before heading into the office, past the restaurant where we celebrated our first major patent approval, past the park where I had taken calls with Tech Global's technical team discussing integration timelines and deployment strategies. All of it was about to become history. I bought coffee from a 24-hour convenience store and found a bench overlooking the harbor. The water was calm, reflecting the pre-dawn city lights in a way that made everything look stable and permanent. Appearances could be deceptive. My phone buzzed with a news alert. Tech Global Industries confirms Q4 acquisition timeline on track. The brief article quoted David expressing confidence about closing their strategic expansion into autonomous systems before the end of the fiscal quarter. The reporter had spoken with industry analysts who praised Tech Global's approach of acquiring proven technology rather than developing it internally. One analyst comment stood out. Tech Global is paying a premium, but they're buying 7 years of research and development that would cost them significantly more to replicate. The Nexus patent portfolio gives them immediate competitive advantage in multiple high-growth sectors. I sipped my coffee and thought about Sarah Kim, probably sitting in Tech Global's headquarters planning integration schedules and budget allocations for technology that would never be available for integration. About David, whose confidence in closing the deal was about to be shattered by an automatically triggered email he wasn't expecting, the morning shift stirred in the financial district as lights flickered on in office windows and early arriving executives prepared for another day of managing deals and strategic initiatives. Somewhere in that corporate landscape, Marcus Hudson was likely reviewing financial projections based on a $500 million acquisition that would never materialize, while Victoria Hudson was starting her day satisfied with having eliminated a high-salary employee before expensive stock options vested, completely unaware she had destroyed her family's financial future. By mid-morning, I was back in my apartment monitoring the countdown, now reading 58 hours, 14 minutes, and 33 seconds, organizing technical documentation and preparing for the conversations that would follow when Tech Global received my automated notification. Kim would want detailed briefings, David would question licensing terms, and legal would verify patent ownership and explore alternatives. Nexus stock had already reached a 52-week high on acquisition optimism, and the Hudson stake was at an all-time paper value that was about to become worthless. Evening arrived with a clear sky, city lights bright. While I reflected on the downtown district where deals were made and fortunes built and destroyed. The countdown ticked steadily towards zero, the quiet storm of an automated email prepared to reshape everything, a storm 7 years in the making. The first call came at 9:47 a.m., 34 hours and 13 minutes before zero, from Jennifer Walsh, Tech Global's general counsel, politely raising questions about the ownership of patents, US 10,847, 392 through US 10,847, 405. She noted my name as the primary inventor but flagged unusual assignment provisions. I let silence stretch before confirming. The assignment provisions are standard for my employment agreement. Is there something specific you need clarification on? She explained that while the understanding was that all patents would belong to Nexus, the contract language suggested ownership could revert under certain circumstances. That's correct, I replied, watching the countdown continue its inexorable march toward the moment that would undo everything Victoria thought she had controlled. I confirmed that the patent assignments included a reversion clause tied to my stock vesting schedule. If my employment was terminated involuntarily before my options fully vested, ownership reverted to me personally. There was a long pause on the other end, and I imagined Jennifer Walsh pulling up contract documents, scanning legal language, and making rapid calculations about what this meant for Tech Global's $500 million deal. I see, she said finally. And would you be able to confirm your current employment status with Nexus? I was terminated yesterday morning, I replied. My stock vesting is scheduled to complete in approximately 33 hours. Another pause, longer this time. I could practically hear the legal wheels turning as she processed the implications. Tech Global had spent 9 months negotiating to acquire patents that in 33 hours would no longer belong to the company they were trying to buy. Ms. Mitchell, would you be willing to participate in a conference call with our executive team this afternoon? I think this situation requires immediate attention. I'm available, I said, but I should mention the patent reversion is automated. There's no manual process that can delay or interrupt it. Understood, Jennifer said, though her tone suggested she was still grasping the full scope of what she'd just learned. We ended the call, but I knew this was only the opening move in a very complicated day for Tech Global's legal team, who had spent months conducting due diligence, reviewing technical documentation, and preparing integration plans based on acquiring specific intellectual property, only to discover the assets were about to vanish from the deal entirely. I opened my email to find 3 new messages from Tech Global, all with subject lines signaling urgent legal review, patent ownership verification request, employment contract analysis needed, and acquisition timeline reassessment. The machine was already in motion on their end, lawyers and executives scrambling to understand how a routine personnel termination at Nexus could potentially unravel their entire expansion strategy. My phone buzzed with a text from a number I didn't recognize. Miss Mitchell, this is David's assistant. David would like to schedule an emergency call this afternoon regarding the Nexus acquisition. Are you available at 3:30 p.m.? I confirmed I was, leaned back in my chair, and watched the countdown timer. 33 hours, 51 minutes, 19 seconds. Time was still moving in my favor, and Tech Global was only beginning to comprehend what they were racing against. At exactly 3:30 p.m., the second call came. The caller ID showed Tech Global Industries' main corporate number, and a slight echo revealed a conference room speakerphone. Miss Mitchell, this is David. I'm here with Sarah Kim and Jennifer Walsh. Thank you for making time on short notice. His voice carried the controlled tension of an executive realizing that his carefully planned strategic acquisition rested on a foundation about to crumble. In the background, I heard paper shuffling, rapid typing, someone taking meticulous notes. I understand there may be some complications with a patent ownership situation, he continued. Jennifer briefed me on our morning conversation and asked if I could help them understand exactly what they were dealing with. I glanced at my countdown timer. 28 hours, 30 minutes, and 14 seconds. I explained that my employment contract with Nexus included a provision stating that patent ownership reverts to me personally if I am terminated involuntarily before my stock options fully vest, which had happened yesterday morning. And your vesting was scheduled for when? Sarah Kim asked. Tomorrow at 5 p.m., I replied. The silence that followed was heavy with implication. I could picture the 3 of them at Tech Global's conference table, realizing that their 9-month acquisition process was about to collapse because of a contract clause nobody at Nexus had flagged. David cleared his throat. Mitchell, help me understand the scope here. Which patents are affected? I pulled up my portfolio on screen. 14 patents covering autonomous systems, predictive maintenance, and human-machine interfaces, including US 1,847,392 through US 1,847,405, representing approximately 85% of the intellectual property value in the Nexus acquisition. More silence. I could hear someone exhale, probably Jennifer calculating the legal implications. Those are the core patents, Kim said flatly, realization in her voice. Without those, the acquisition doesn't make strategic sense for us. That's correct, I confirmed. The remaining patents are peripheral, with no standalone commercial value. David's voice became carefully measured, trying to manage a crisis without panicking. Ms. Mitchell, is there any way to delay or modify this reversion process? Any mechanism in your contract for negotiation? The reversion is automated, I explained. It cannot be delayed or reversed. Ownership transfers automatically when the vesting deadline passes. What about Nexus? Jennifer asked. Has anyone contacted you there? No, I said. They're not aware of the implications. I could hear urgent whispering in the background, David conferring with his team about emergency options, legal strategies, and the increasingly obvious reality that their $500 million acquisition was about to evaporate. Finally, David asked, "Would you be willing to consider licensing arrangements directly with Tech Global? Obviously, this isn't how we plan to structure this relationship, but if you're going to own the patents, perhaps we can work something out." This was the opening I had expected. "I'd be open to licensing discussions," I said, "but my priorities will differ from Nexus's. I want to work with companies that understand the technology and respect the engineering behind it." "We absolutely respect the engineering," Kim said quickly. "You've always been essential to making this technology work at our scale." "I appreciate that," I replied. "Once the patent transfer completes tomorrow, I'll be ready to discuss licensing arrangements that make sense for both parties." David's audible relief was immediate. "That's very good to hear. Jennifer, can you start drafting preliminary terms for a licensing agreement?" "Already on it," she replied. The call continued for 15 more minutes, covering technical details and timeline questions, but the essential points were clear. Tech Global couldn't acquire the patents from Nexus because Nexus wouldn't own them in 28 hours, yet they could license them directly from me under terms that would give me far more control and compensation than I'd ever received as a Nexus employee. When the call ended, I sat back in my chair, savoring a quiet, professional satisfaction. In 28 hours, I would own patents worth $340 million and generate $47 million in annual licensing revenue, giving Tech Global access to the technology they needed, probably under better terms than they would have received from Nexus, while the only losers would be Nexus Technologies and the Hudson family, whose $500 million windfall was evaporating because Victoria had tried to save $150,000 on my stock vesting. Sometimes the most devastating business decisions are the ones that seem perfectly logical until their consequences become unavoidable. The third call came at 8:23 a.m. the next morning, less than 9 hours before the countdown would reach 0. This time, the caller ID showed Marcus Hudson's direct line. I let it ring twice before answering. "Ava, we need to talk." His voice was tight with stress, completely lacking the polished confidence I'd heard in 7 years of board meetings and client presentations. "Good morning, Marcus," I replied calmly. "Good morning." "Nothing," he snapped. "Do you have any idea what you've done? Tech Global called me at home last night. They're threatening to withdraw from the acquisition entirely." I glanced at the countdown timer. 8 hours, 36 minutes, 47 seconds. "I haven't done anything, Marcus. I signed the termination letter your daughter presented and cleared out my office as requested." "Don't play games with me, Ava. This patent reversion clause. When were you planning to tell us about it?" The question revealed everything. Marcus, the CFO who had overseen every major financial decision for a decade, was just now learning about a contract provision that had been in my agreement for 7 years. "The clause has been in my contract since I was hired," I said calmly. "It was negotiated during my initial employment discussions. Your legal team reviewed and approved it 7 years ago." His composure was cracking. "Nobody remembers contract details from 7 years ago." "I do," I replied, "and I assumed your legal team maintained proper documentation for key personnel involved in major acquisitions." Silence stretched long enough for me to imagine Marcus scanning the files, realizing this catastrophic oversight was entirely self-inflicted. "Ava, let's be practical about this," he said finally, shifting to the negotiating tone I'd heard him use with difficult clients. "Victoria made a mistake. I'm willing to acknowledge that. What do you need to make this right? Reinstatement? Accelerated vesting? A promotion?" "Marcus, the patent transfer is automated. It executes in 8.5 hours whether I want it to or not. There's no mechanism to stop it or reverse it." There has to be something. Now, Ava, this deal is worth $500 million. My family's entire financial future is tied up in Nexus stock. If this acquisition fails... He didn't finish, but I could complete it for him. If the Tech Global acquisition failed, Nexus would lose its primary exit strategy, leaving the company valuable, but not at the inflated levels that made the Hudsons wealthy beyond measure. Victoria's mistake wouldn't just cost the acquisition proceeds, it would trap them in a company they'd been planning to cash out of. I understand the implications, I said, but the legal framework is clear. In 8 hours, I'll own the patents Tech Global wanted. The acquisition, as structured, becomes impossible. What about licensing? Marcus asked quickly. If you own the patents, you could license them back to us. We could still complete the deal with Tech Global. I could license them, I agreed, but that would require new negotiations, new terms, and probably a very different financial structure. Tech Global wants to own the technology, not license it from a third party. Marcus exhaled sharply. What are your terms? The question I'd been waiting for. I haven't decided yet, I said. When the transfer is complete this afternoon, I'll be in a position to consider arrangements, but Tech Global has already reached out about licensing directly from me. The implications hit him immediately. If Tech Global could license the patents from me, they didn't need to acquire Nexus at all. They could get the technology they wanted without paying $500 million for a company that would no longer own its most valuable assets. Jesus Christ, Ava, do you understand what you're doing to us? He demanded. I'm not doing anything to you, Marcus. I'm responding to decisions made without my input or consent. Victoria terminated me to avoid paying my vesting benefits. Now you're dealing with the consequences. The call continued for 10 minutes with Marcus alternating between negotiation attempts and barely controlled anger, offering reinstatement, accelerated vesting, equity increases, and executive positions. None of it mattered. The legal mechanism was in motion and would execute regardless of what anyone at Nexus wanted. When we finally ended the call, I leaned back and watched the countdown timer. 8 hours, 4 minutes, 12 seconds. In 8 hours, Victoria Hudson's cost-saving personnel decision would officially cost her family's company $500 million in acquisition proceeds. Marcus Hudson's financial future would be permanently altered because he failed to maintain oversight of employment contract provisions. Tech Global would discover that the most expensive acquisitions are sometimes the ones that never close. I thought about Victoria, probably in her corner office, finally reading the employment contracts and patent documentation she should have reviewed 2 days ago, learning that her MBA and consulting experience hadn't prepared her for the technical realities of managing intellectual property in a tech company. The morning sun streamed through my apartment windows, illuminating the white bars covered in technical diagrams that would soon become the foundation of my own technology licensing empire.